relevant focus with Ijaz Haider. Although a general war between India and Pakistan is unlikely, crises between the two are likely to become more intense, risking an escalatory cycle. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India is more likely than in the past to respond with military force to perceived or real Pakistani provocations, and heightened tensions raise the risk of conflict between the two nuclear-armed neighbors, with violent unrest in Kashmir or a militant attack in India being potential flashpoints. Thus reads the annual threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community put out by Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It is placed under the subheading Conflicts and Instability. The section also deals with other areas like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Middle East, etc. The assessment does not assess the situation in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir in any detail, and it follows the standard template of how a conflict is likely to start. For instance, in November 2019, Toby Dalton and Gaurav Kalwani, might India start the next South Asia crisis? And they argue, and I quote from what they've written, instead of an attack in India that initiates crisis, what if one arose following a proactive Indian operation to seize territory over the line of control in the portion of the disputed territory of Kashmir controlled by Pakistan? Indian leaders have contemplated such operations in the past, and the current government in India has demonstrated its willingness to take considerable risks, including in the February 2019 crisis. Moreover, New Delhi's August 2019 decision to revoke the special constitutional status of Kashmir underscores its willingness to reconsider long-standing norms and practices. If the next crisis starts with an Indian operation, the odds are much greater that it will escalate quickly to war for reasons that the conventional South Asia crisis wisdom tends to discount. Unquote. To discuss this further, I am joined by Carl Colton-Taylor, Professor of Political Science at the University of Akron, and Fahad Humayun, a PhD candidate in Political Science at Yale University, writes for Foreign Policy and other journals, and has long experience of convening track 2 dialogues between India and Pakistan. Let me begin with Professor Colton-Taylor here. Professor Colton-Taylor, I agree, as I said in my opening, the assessment is essentially on the basis of the old standard template. But as I said, quoting from what Toby Dalton and his co-writer wrote, there's every possibility of India initiating a proactive action and that escalating into a bigger conflict. Give me your initial thoughts on the intelligence assessment and the situation on the ground as you look at it.
I tend to agree with the kind of bottom line assessment that we see from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. I think it's actually somewhat likely that we could see conflict in the next couple of years if India perceives provocation from Pakistan. I think it's possible but unlikely that India would engage in proactive attacks against Pakistan. I think the possibility of a conflict has risen over the last few years, and a great contributing factor to that is the nationalism that has been stoked by the BJP in India, and the rhetoric that you hear in the Indian press, Indian media, about Pakistan being a threat to India. That's all risen to a very high pitch, and I think it does raise the probability that you could have conflict. I don't think it's inevitable. I think it's actually below 50% within the next year. I think the most likely cause of it, though, will be some perceived provocation, likely from militants that India says are supported by the Pakistani government.
Okay, now the thing is that for the longest of times, and this is on the basis of what the Indians themselves have been saying, they're talking about the Kashmiri freedom fighters, who they call terrorists. That's part of their rhetoric. Number about 200, sometimes less than 200. Indian security forces also boast of the fact that the average lifespan of the Kashmiri freedom fighter is about 6 months to a year once he's identified. So, and this boast is with reference to their what they call their counterterrorism grid operations. So there is absolutely no indication of any provocation on the part of Pakistan. And this is something which is also being acknowledged by some analysts within India that have raised questions about some of these incidents that the Indian government has been calling terror attacks. So I think for an independent analysis, it's also important to keep some of these factors in mind with reference to how New Delhi approaches these and how it tries to exploit it.
Yes, I agree. The perception is huge here and how things get framed. And so if you have attacks on Indian forces or purported attacks on Indian forces, it's very, very important to how the Indian government reacts to that. Do they blame it on Pakistan? Do they say that these are local militants that have nothing to do with the Pakistani forces? I think that increasingly you're seeing a very jingoistic media pressure on the Indian government that the Indian government itself has kind of fostered to blame any kind of attacks within Kashmir on Pakistan, the Pakistani government. That's not very new, but there's more pressure now. There's more incentive to do that, both on the part of the Indian media and on the part of the Indian government. And that creates a dangerous scenario. When you have incentives to escalate, that's something that...
Yeah, and plus it seems that, they might just have locked themselves in a commitment trap. But stay with me, Professor Kortenthaler. Let me pull in Father Humayun here. Father Humayun, you've written about this. As I said, you have convened a number of track 2 meetings between India and Pakistan. Give me your sense of how you have seen things change with the change of government in India, and not just from the Congress government to the BJP government, but also between Modi 1.0 and Modi 2.0.
Thank you, Ijaz Sahab. I think there's a very definitive new politics of aspiration that is in play at the moment in India. This politics of aspiration has developed not overnight. It's the product of India's experiment with liberalization and opening up its economy. And over the course of the past 10 years, we have seen a distinct change take place in political attitudes towards India, in which this politics of aspiration has now found, voice in political representatives who have promised to change the status quo. We see this very clearly in the persona of Narendra Modi, who's the current Prime Minister of India, but also in the persona of the party that he heads. So the BJP is an anti-status quo party. It has promised to revise the rules of the game, not just domestically, but also, I think, geopolitically. If you look at the BJP's manifestos, there is a definite sort of indication of border revisionism, changing India's geopolitical confines, this idea of a greater India, which many BJP aspirants have longed for. What the BJP has been very successful in doing is wedding this notion of this new nationalism to the politics of aspiration that is largely sort of embodied in India's growing middle class, but also within the Indian elite. Now, why is this problematic in the context of India and Pakistan? I think the BJP has very successfully cultivated certain audience costs for any sort of foreign policy engagement that it has with an external adversary, be that China, be it Pakistan. Those audience costs are very dangerous because I think they lead to two potential risks. One is the risk of selecting into a crisis with an adversary, and one is escalating further once that crisis has already sort of selected into. And I think it's important to treat the two as analytically distinct, because in your opening remarks, you very nicely laid out how the two are different. India has shown that it has the incentives to actually do both, which we know is very dangerous for crisis escalation in South Asia, given that there are very few mechanisms to actually de-escalate, to dial back once a crisis is underway.
Okay. It's interesting that you also mentioned China. So let me go back to Professor Kortenthaler here. Professor, let's for a moment set the Pakistani side of the equation aside and talk about Sino-Indian relations. Now, on 5th August 2019, when India illegally and setting aside in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions with reference to Kashmir, and also, frankly, as the petitions in the Indian Supreme Court are very clear, a sleight of hand with reference to its own constitution, annexed Jammu and Kashmir. The very next day, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs talked about Ladakh and raised serious objections to the Indian move. And later we've seen, over the last 8-9 months, there's been a crisis at the line of actual control between China and India. So it seems that now it's not just about India and Pakistan, there's also the Chinese factor. And in both cases, the area is the disputed area, which is a recognized dispute on the agenda of the UN Security Council. Now, my question to you is, given the United States' closeness to India, do you think it would be in the fitness of things for the Biden administration to actually try and get India to reverse course, and in order for this region to be more stable with less possibility of a conflict?
It would absolutely be in the interest of the United States to try to dial down the sense of tension that exists between India and China and India and Pakistan. The United States has no interest in any kind of conflict between those three countries. So I think there are discussions that are going on behind the scenes between U.S. diplomats and Indian diplomats, with the United States conveying concern with some of the things that they've seen. I think this is meant to be more private than public, because I think they know that if they do this publicly, it will likely be counterproductive. Part of this is because of the very, very strong sense of kind of nationalist anger at any pressure on India to change its policies or change its course. So this is being said privately. There is significant concern about this. But having said that, I don't think you're going to see a public pressure campaign by the Biden administration on the Indians to kind of dial back some of this nationalist rhetoric or what may be seen as provocative actions.
Okay, one final question, Professor Kortenthaler, and this is with reference to what the world has been witnessing over the last 6 years, but specifically more so in the last 2 years. There is the identity politics, there is the right-wing approaches, which is the Hindutva ideology, which is very different from Hinduism as a creed. Hindutva is a very political ideology. It has, as lots of analysts in the world have pointed out, it has fascist streaks. And all of this has resulted in greater intolerance towards the minorities, especially the Muslims, but not just the Muslims, also the Dalits, and Christians. Is this something which is or should be of concern to the United States? And I ask this because President Biden had indicated that he's going to have a big conference of democracies. And I'm assuming that by that one refers to liberal democracies and not majoritarian, coercive, exclusionary democracies, even if there is a form of it, but increasingly less substance.
Absolutely, this is a concern to the United States. The trend towards, as you call it, majoritarianism in India, or a Hindu first kind of attitude about what India represents, is definitely troubling to people who are in the foreign policy establishment in the United States. I mean, India seems to be taking a turn from a secular kind of multi-communal democracy towards something which could potentially get ugly in the future. It's already become ugly, but uglier. So that's once again something that's being raised in public. At the same time, the United States government, and it's not just Biden, it could be any government that comes into power in the United States in the next several years, really faces a difficult quandary, and that is, how do you deal with an India that is becoming increasingly illiberal when you need India against what is viewed as the predominant security threat to the United States, and that is China? So India has become one of those countries where the United States probably would rather see different politics in the country, but at the same time needs it as part of a balance against the perceived security threat from China. So this is a really difficult situation for the U.S. government.
Certainly a quandary, certainly a very difficult situation. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Carl Colton-Thaler speaking with us. We go back to Fahd Humayun here. Fahd, this is also an issue of presenting the narrative. And I think that is where we have lagged behind in ways that need to be rectified. Do you see, since you're there, you are in the US, you're studying there, you come across the policy community as also the academia, do you see or do you get a sense that the sort of goody-goody Indian narrative that India developed over the last 3 decades is finally giving way to the realization of the reality on the ground in India?
I think that's an excellent question. There are certainly signs that Modi's version of India and the sort of undoing of the more liberal credentials that India was famous for under previous governments has raised concern in a lot of circles, in academic circles in particular, which monitor things like levels of democracy. We know at least 2 democracy rankings, Freedom House and then BDEM based in Europe, have actually revised their assessments of where India stands on a spectrum of authoritarianism to democracy. And increasingly there are voices in the United States which recognize and say that perhaps in what we're seeing in India is the rise of perhaps an electocracy as opposed to a democracy because of the weakening democratic norms that are associated with institutionalized democratic regimes. At the same time, though, I think the co-panelists that you had on the show correctly identified that there is a definite tension here because in terms of how the United States views India and the narrative that it has built around India, that's undergirded by the presence of a very strong, very proactive Indian diaspora, which is, engaged not just in, various sort of sectors of American society, but also now in American politics. So the Indian lobby has been able to articulate the utility that India has to the United States very much in the way the Israeli lobby in India, in the United States, has articulated the utility that Israel has for the United States. And because of that, I think when the United States looks at India and looks at what's happening in terms of democracy, what's happening in terms of human rights on the ground, there's a trade-off that the United States then has to make in terms of the perceived utility that it can get from keeping India on its side. So the containment of China, as the co-panelist mentioned, is of course an overriding and overarching, I think, need that the United States has at the moment. And even in the annual threat assessment report that you referenced in your opening remarks, the language of that threat assessment report is very much steeped in containing the China threat. So I think in terms of going forward, whether the United States ever calls India out on human rights, on what's happening in democratic backsliding, all of that will be conditional on not antagonizing India, the largest strategic player, which has a very clear and specific purpose, which is to safeguard the United States' Indo-Pacific strategy and contain China.
I agree with you, Fahad, because this threat assessment, as a matter of fact, the two state actors that have been, placed at the top of the threat assessment list is, of course, China and Russia. But stay with me, Fahad. I'm now joined by Gaur Gilani, an eminent Kashmiri journalist and author of Kashmir, Rage and Reason. Mr. Gilani, we're discussing the U.S. intelligence threat assessment, annual threat assessment, and it's the standard template being that there's a possibility of a militant attack in India or in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir, and then given how Narendra Modi has been operating, he is likely to retaliate against Pakistan, and that's likely to get the two sides in a conflict. Now, quite apart from that, I want you, since you follow these very, very closely, this whole idea over many, many years, in fact, of what India calls terrorist attacks. Can you tell our viewers any one instance of these incidents where the Indian government has managed very clearly, transparently, and a decision about who was responsible and whether the culprits were brought to the book?
There have been, some civilian massacres in Kashmir in the early 90s also. And in 2000, when Mr. Clinton visited New Delhi, and there was a big massacre in which 35 Sikhs, members of the Sikh community, got killed. And it got, it became very controversial, and they first blamed the militants for the attack. And then immediately afterwards, a couple of days, in fact, the very next morning, 5 laborers from a nearby village in Pathribal, which is in South Kashmir, were killed. And they were dubbed as foreign mercenaries, foreign terrorists, and militants. And it turned out to be that they were all local laborers who had nothing to do with militancy. That came out through a CBI inquiry. And there have been other, about the Matsil fake encounter where civilians were killed. And then the recent one in Shopaya, where again 3 boys from Rajouri were gunned down, the poor workers who had gone to Shopaya to find some work. So, if you analyze these incidents from the early 90s and until very recently to this Shopaya incident, so there have been many, many such instances where it has, people have been killed and dubbed as militants and, been held responsible for such and such attack. And later it turned out that they were innocent civilians. So, yes, given that backdrop, and also I was listening very carefully to the earlier guest, Mr. Fahad, Humayun, if I'm not mistaken. So given what is currently happening in India, if you see the videos of Shamshan Ghats or the graveyards and cemeteries, and you see that how people are dying outside the hospitals in ambulances, India received more than 270,000 cases of COVID-19 yesterday, and some 1,600 people got killed. So there is also this possibility. Many people are also talking about that this is the time to deflect attention, where Mr. Modi, given his penchant for attention diversion, he can do something which you call a false flag operation, and there are possibilities of such things happening in the near future, because right now there are calls being made, Modi resign Modi, and there's a lot of pressure being put by the opposition and the civil society, and also some sections of intelligentsia, including those who have voted for Modi government in the past. So I don't know about the how the US, I have, of course, I have read that report, but I'm not sure in what context it is. But right now, the situation seems to be ripe for any such eventuality. Fingers crossed. Let's hope that, sanity prevails.
Now, very important, Ms. Gilani, what you're talking about, the second rising COVID-19 wave, because, this is an occupational hazard. One has to obviously monitor the Indian media. So one of the things that we've noticed that somewhat pliant media has also started voicing some kind of reservations with reference to how the Modi government has tackled the COVID-19 crisis. And for the first time, it seems that there is a sense that this thing is getting out of hand. Now, I completely agree that this could be, this is like, it gives him the space to actually try and deflect that. But let's talk a little about what you have witnessed with reference to this, these reservations about the inefficiencies or lack of capability of the central government as well as the state governments to tackle this COVID-19 crisis.
I will give you the entire context. I was just now watching, before coming to your program, I was watching a video from Varanasi, which is also called as Banaras, and it happens to be the constituency of Mr. Narendra Modi. So there, one of the supporters of Mr. Modi, she's a female who has posted this 3-minute video, where in the backdrop you can see the funeral pyres, lined up, a massive number of funeral pyres happening at the same time. And she is calling Mr. Narendra Modi that this is what you have given us. You have not visited this place. And this is the Vikas, which means development in Hindi. This is what you have done. And you have given this, these deaths to us. And then there is another poet who is also an actor. He has posted poetry. But the members of the media fraternity who are ideologically wedded to the larger Hindutva project, even some sections of that media are starting to criticize, because now it's home. It has come home, where bodies are being buried and bodies are being cremated. And this is happening outside the hospitals in Gujarat. This is happening outside the hospitals in Delhi and also in Maharashtra. So now, when you receive body bags, when the families are receiving body bags, those even who are on the ideological weed, high on the ideological weed, will not tolerate this kind of, because he had given this impression that humne Mahabharat ki tarah Corona ko jeet liya. We won the Mahabharata in 21 days or something, and we will defeat Corona in 24 days or something like that. So once then he started addressing these huge gatherings and rallies along with his Lieutenant Mr. Amit Shah in West Bengal especially, and other states that were going for elections in Tamil Nadu and Assam and Puducherry, which is one of the union territories. So once, and he also allowed this Hindu religious Kumbh Mela, which is a huge gathering of lakhs of Hindu devotees who take a holy dip in the Ganges. So once the COVID-19 cases started emerging from these very places where the election rallies were held and where this Kumbh Mela was organized, and then on the other hand, they were announcing night curfews in a place like Kashmir, which is a home for only like about 80 lakh people, and they were allowing tourists from Gujarat and Maharashtra to come and attend the tulip festivals to showcase normalcy. So on the one hand, they wanted to show normalcy in Kashmir by throwing open tulip gardens and musical concerts and Pahalgam and Gulmarg valleys. And then also, with Ramzan, they started doing these, imposing, curfews. So this contradiction is now being called out. Once he addresses and praises the large attendance of audiences and at the same time says that I'm fighting Corona. So now, strong opposition is coming. Even the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh has written a very scathing letter, which is now being replied by one of the health ministers. Yeah. So yes.
He's written, absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Gaur Gilani speaking with us. Let me quickly go back to Fahad Humayun for one final question. Fahad, Gaur Gilani said that, given the situation, there's a possibility that Modi might want to deflect and, what best option but to, somehow start something with Pakistan. On the other hand, someone would argue that perhaps because the economy has nosedived, because he's under trouble with reference to Corona, this is probably not the time that he will undertake some kind of adventure. Which side of the coin are you likely to fall?
So Ijaz Sahab, I think India's next general election is in 2024. But before that, there are going to be a series of state elections, and we know that whenever the state elections approach, the BJP sort of ratchets up the kind of rhetoric it uses against minorities, as well as against these external adversaries that it can otherize effectively for domestic political gains. So my sense is that right now, I think while with COVID going on, and I think the central government's complete focus will be on dealing with the emergency situation, I don't think that the BJP is necessarily going to use the COVID crisis as an occasion to deflect attention from this by selecting into crisis with Pakistan. I think the danger that lies ahead, and this is a real danger, one which the threat assessment report also recognizes, is what happens after COVID. So once the crisis is over, we know that the BJP hasn't been able to fix the Indian economy, and that those economic aspirations are even more on the back foot now as a result of a year and a half of the pandemic. I think then there will be a real question of public discourse in India, and whether that public discourse stands behind Prime Minister Modi or it starts looking for alternatives. And if it does that, then I think that's go on.
Yeah, and I said, and that economy and other problems wedded to the acquisition of some of the state-of-the-art platforms like the S-400 A280 system and all that could possibly play a role, in Mr. Modi trying to do some kind of adventure.
The thing which is, if you look at the literature on diversionary war theory, it's predicated on there being a traditional enemy, which can easily be targeted to mobilize public support in favor of an incumbent. So I think all of that, the ingredients are really there for this false flag operation, or whatever you call it, to take place. But I think the Modi government will also be very careful about trying to sort of present this as a provocation from the Pakistani side, because I think there will be increased scrutiny also under a Biden administration. And so the Modi government may initially make some attempts, as we are seeing right now, to try and engage Pakistan in dialogue, try to improve relations. But we know that deep down, the ideological core of the BJP sees coexistence with Pakistan as untenable. And that's when I think we will see these sort of compulsions and tensions come into play.
Absolutely, that's a real concern. Thank you so much. That was Fahad Humayun. Joining me now is Lieutenant General Ghulam Mustafa, former Corps Commander of Pakistan Army. General Mustafa, thank you for being on the program. We were discussing the U.S. intelligence threat assessment, annual threat assessment, and the template is the same. some kind of militant attack and Modi then retaliating and Pakistan and India getting into a conflict. Now, Father Mayu had a very interesting, approach to this. And he was arguing that what Modi government is likely to do is to try and reach out to Pakistan and to signal to the United States that they want to have a reasonable relationship with Pakistan. And then at some point, closer to the next elections, do a false flag and blame Pakistan for it. Is that a scenario that you think you would agree with?
In outline, yes. I've also been saying for all this while that war between India and Pakistan is something we are heading into. It can happen today or it can happen 2 years down the road. That is something that can be discussed. However, the fact that we have to go to war is something kind of a destiny. That is how I look at it. Because how the whole world is now shaping up is something we tend to ignore when we are talking about this relationship between the two countries in this region. America has signed up India for a long haul. If you look at the kind of agreements which have come through starting 2016, Limoa to Bika, these agreements have been going into the details. One finds that India is as close to being America's strategic partner as possible. And Americans would like India to get that kind of a space where it can strengthen itself from within and be able to stand up to what they feel is a partner to the growing influence of China in the region and also Russia in the region. So in this backdrop, definitely the Americans would like, and so would the Indian government as of now, to get some kind of a breathing space. But that does not mean that we are going into the kind of thaw that will give us 4 to 5, 6 years. No. This is something that may not happen. Because as soon as India finds itself in a position where it can go beyond 370 and 35A in Indian-held Kashmir, because disturbing this growing Chinese influence in the region, like CPEC, and destabilizing Gilgit and Baltistan as a minimum, is something that India is already working on. So therefore, I feel that we are in for a long haul with India, and war is something that we'll see. Its mechanics, how it comes about, may be a little different from what I think, from one that you just pointed out. And that again is quite reasonable, that buying itself sufficient time and come to by about next election time, go for the same kind of environments that were created post Parliament attack, post Bombay.
So General Mustafa, you're basically arguing that A, we cannot let our guard down, and B, that there is a war going on. It may not be overt, it may not be a hot war across the line of control or the international border, but war it is nevertheless.
Obviously, I mean, the war, the kind of war that are being fought today is really not kinetic as much as it is on the other fields. And we are at war. If you see, we have this, discussion going on about TLP, and the kind of build-up that it got from across the line. It is mind-boggling. Over 250,000 counts developing a theory that we are in civil war. And mind you, when you go to the bare bones of what is happening with TLP, there will be a lot of money involved somewhere else. The point is that Pakistan is something that India just cannot tolerate. Not as a strong Pakistan, not as one united Pakistan, not as Pakistan which can oppose India's hegemony in the region. That is a given. As basics, it may sound primitive, but that is as basic and primitive as it is.
It's not primitive at all. It's the essence of what we call structural realism. And structural realism, is very clear that unless Pakistan decides to live as a subordinate power, it will always have to put up with India's rivalry. Thank you so much. That was Lieutenant General Ghulam Mustafa speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the worsening COVID-19 situation in India. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. The second COVID-19 wave seems to be overwhelming India's healthcare system. Two problems stand out. The first is a new variant, which has a so-called double mutations. Experts believe it is fueling India's deadlier new wave of infections. Given the caseload and the numbers of infected, India is now the world's second worst hit country, surpassing Brazil. By all reports in the Indian media, the rising numbers have begun to overwhelm hospitals and crematoriums. The second problem is the rising number of deaths, or CFR, case fatality rate. The government had said it wants to keep it at 1 or below 1%. It has risen to 1.3%. According to calculations done by Hindustan Times and Indian newspaper, if this trend of a CFR of 1.3% continues, it would mean that India is set to touch a record number of daily deaths. That will exponentially increase. The projection is scary, and for once the media, generally pliant, have begun to question the BJP government's handling of the crisis. To discuss the situation further, I am joined by Daria Unatmaz, Professor of Immunology at the Jackson Laboratory for Genomic Medicine. Dr. Unatmaz, give me your sense of what's happening in India.
The situation in India, as you summarized, is a total disaster. The case numbers are exponentially increasing. The latest was about 275,000 cases in one day. The real numbers are likely to be much higher than that, and probably even the death numbers are higher. And this is definitely being caused by relaxed precautions, but also a new variant or number of variant viruses that are spreading. Also had spread in England and other parts of the world. So this is actually rather a new kind of a virus that has gained more abilities to infect faster and escape the immune system. So this makes it very, very worrying.
So we have all seen that there have been some state elections, so there's been electioneering. The Prime Minister of India himself has been addressing large rallies. Then there have been these religious festivals like the Kumbh Mela in Varanasi, where more than 2.5 million people gathered. Do you think these are also factors that have led to increase in the caseload?
Absolutely. I think they've definitely contributed. And as I said, I mean, the virus in the past 1 year has gained new mutations and has become more smarter, in quotations, if you like, has the ability to escape our immune system and spread faster. But unfortunately, our precautions have actually gone the reverse. This is actually the time to be the most vigilant about this virus infection until we get at least 60% of the population or half of the population vaccinated. And we've seen these examples in the world, like in Israel and even England. But without very strict lockdowns and precautions, the virus is going to spread like crazy.
Okay, so there's been the UK variant, which also reached Pakistan, has reached India also. Now we're talking about this double mutation. Then there was a Brazilian variant, and there's a South African variant. And you also said that the virus is getting smarter. So these variations, how far are they going to impact the efficacy of the vaccines that are currently being administered in the world?
So right now there are two types of mutations that are of concern. One type of mutation that happened in England, it's called 501 or B117. Basically, that mutant virus or variant virus has the ability to spread faster because it binds to its lock better on the surface of the cell. The other type are the ones that can escape the immune system, in particular the antibodies. So the one from South Africa, Brazil, has this ability. So what happens is that when you are able to escape the antibodies, then the virus is able to infect those who have been previously infected. So you get second infections, And then the efficacy of the vaccines are also reduced. And we've seen this in real life in real life trials as well for a number of vaccine trials, that the ones that are done in South Africa was less efficacious. But it's important to point out that the vaccines are still very effective in preventing the severe disease or deaths. So even though that because of these mutations, your chances of getting infected and having mild symptoms increase and therefore also infect other people, so that's not a good thing. But at least with the vaccination, you can greatly reduce the number of severe disease conditions. That's because our immune system also has an arm called T cells. Those are not really affected by these mutations, and they're sort of backup forces that allow the virus not to get to a very worst point in your body. But clearly, the mutations in particular in India is a double mutation, both of which can escape the antibodies and also make the virus spread faster. So that's one of the worst case scenarios. It's still under investigation, but that makes the whole vaccination process much more difficult. Rather than vaccinating 60%, now you have to vaccinate maybe 80, 90% of the population. And so it becomes a much difficult situation.
Okay, so the transmissibility has increased, but has the virulence also increased?
So that's a good question. For example, the one in England, it was thought that maybe the virulence or the ability of the virus to cause more severe disease, especially in the young people, could have increased a bit. But that's been a little bit controversial. There's not very good data to suggest that. The one in Brazil looks worse, P1 mutation, P1 variant, that the suggestion is that, or the observation is that it is maybe causing more severe disease because the deaths are increasing. And as you pointed out, the frequency of mortality, the IFR, is also increasing in India. Whether that's because of this variant virus remains to be determined, but that's certainly also a possibility.
Great. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Daria Onatmas speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. And as always, and as we have just discussed, given the third COVID-19 wave, both in Pakistan and across the world, stay safe and follow the non-vaccine safety protocols. Good night and goodbye.